everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack. I'm incredibly grateful to say that my guest today is PJ Dushkin. He not only lives in Alaska, he was raised there during the Cold War and has really interesting stories about a mindset of emotional grit that it takes to live in Alaska. So please feel free to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel at Emotional Grit. And thanks for joining us today. All right, PJ, let's get started. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I say thank you for being here, even though you are in Alaska right now and I'm in Minnesota. But thank you for doing this. So now I want to start out just by your experiences when you were growing up. So if you could just tell people what the actual city was and what the island was as part of the Aleutian chain of Alaska, that'd be a great place to start.
So I grew up in, it's called Unalaska. Everybody knows it as Dutch Harbor. It's actually two cities. They each have their own zip code,
Oh,
which, yeah.
okay.
Um, but yeah, I grew up there. Um, what else is there?
Well, I could tell you just to interject for a second, the fact that you grew up in Dutch Harbor, I didn't know when I was in high school, whether it was through lectures or through books I read or anything like that, that the Japanese had attacked us there during World War II. I just learned about Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. I didn't know that they had also attacked Dutch Harbor in Alaska, that there was an actual, I mean, we were attacked. So, but if I remember correctly, when you grew up there, you weren't aware of that either, right? Because it was like decades earlier and no one really talked about it.
yeah, yeah, it was what in July 42, I think it
Yeah, it
was.
was 42.
Um, yeah, and I didn't come along till 75, so
But exactly. And I was in 73. Yeah. But even as far as like in school, I don't ever remember learning about how the Japanese had also attacked us in Alaska, in addition to Hawaii.
yeah,
That's right.
it was we didn't really learn about it. I mean, we heard stories, but when we'd play in the old World War II buildings that are were abandoned, then we were told by the law enforcement, "Hey, you guys stay out of there. It's off limits." But kids being kids, we still would go in and play,
Oh, of course.
right?
Well, you're thinking, why would I not go do that?
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. So you're playing in these presumably bombed out buildings, I would think, from when the Japanese attacked us.
Well, they weren't. They didn't really. I don't think they hit any structurals. These were left over from when the military built it and then pulled out.
Okay.
So, um, I know there was a old theater that they had partially got hit, and we'd gone through it. But I mean, we also, I think, growing up, we needed a warehouse for cans for camp in high school, and we used a part of that building to store all the aluminum cans we collected, and then put them in containers for basketball camps and whatnot.
Okay, that's a good idea. That makes sense. Well, and as we alluded to earlier, we're just 2 years apart. And so when I think about Alaska, I think about also when I lived there. I mean, I was there in sixth and seventh grade in the 1980s. I lived in Anchorage, and I remember back then. Here, I moved there with my family like a week before school started, and there were a fair amount of us kids who were new to Alaska, not just Anchorage, but new to Alaska. And so the kids who lived there for their entire lives would kind of tease us. And they were like, they would say, well, Jennifer, when you walk home from school today, which was in the dark, by the way, because of daylight saving, and not daylight savings, but because of just like how the sun is. There's like hardly any sunlight, if at all, in the winter in Alaska. But they would say, when you walk home today in the dark, you better be careful because the Russians are going to get you. So I was convinced that the Russians were like hidden in bushes. So I would walk home from school and look in the bushes and that kind of thing. And of course, back then, we didn't have access to the internet. So it was more like just your imagination that got the best of you because we couldn't verify or confirm anything online. It just didn't exist. So for
Right.
you, living on one of the Aleutian Islands during the Cold War, what was your experience like in that regard? Was there also kind of a fear of the Soviets, or was it more just kind of a healthy respect for what was going on and not really thinking about it, or what was your experience like?
I don't think we really had any worry about it, I guess. Um, I don't think we had a care in the world, really. We just ran the town and created chaos, and I don't know that I mean, growing up there, and uh, I think we had talked about it before. Um, we had a general store, so there were Russian trawlers or fishing vessels out in the harbor, and they'd get permission to come ashore every once in a while. And that's really the only time we'd see Russians, actual Russians.
So just for context for the listeners here, back then, cable TV, was either new or didn't exist yet. So you were
Right.
lucky. You were lucky if you saw an image in a book of someone from the Soviet Union, or maybe on the news, maybe. But as a kid, you don't watch the news really. So it was just this ominous place called the Soviet Union, and you had no idea what to even think about it. So to have these fishing boats out in the harbor, and then to have them get permission to come to shore, what was it like to see some of the people or interact with them?
Uh, really broken English, really hard to understand. Luckily, our mom could, and our oldest brother could understand and speak a little Russian. So anytime they'd be in the store, it was always, "Hey, mom, you got to come up front," because we can't understand.
Wow. And how did your mom happen to speak Russian?
Just growing up, being a part of Russian Orthodox.
So from
Um,
going to the church services, that's how she
yeah,
learned it? Okay.
yeah,
Wow. And if I remember correctly from when you and I spoke on the phone, didn't the Russians wear like big fur hats? And they were kind
yeah.
of these, so they just looked like kind of larger than life. And I'm picturing like icicles coming off their beards or their mustaches or something.
Yeah, the big bushy hats, and it's when I later in life I moved to ADAC, and I met a guy from Indiana that had a hat like that, and we'd always call him our comrade because of the distinction of the hat. So
Yeah.
it it's very distinctive. Uh,
Right. Wow. And what was it like to actually hear your mom speaking Russian with these people from this far off land? Again, it's during the Cold War, so it was just such a surreal time, but it must have been pretty surreal, I would think.
well, yes and no. Like every weekend, we'd hear Russian when we're at church. So, um, but our mom would always try and teach us Aleutian Russian, and me and the second oldest brother were like, "No, when am I going to need that?" But our oldest brother Pat learned it, and then later on, our littlest brother learned it as well. But we had no desire to
Right.
speak it.
So when you mentioned your mom speaking, did you pronounce it Aleut, the Aleut
Yeah,
language?
yeah.
What kind of an alphabet is that?
Oh man, I'm the wrong person to ask
Is it
for
totally
that.
different than
Yeah,
English?
yeah,
Because that's a language that's actually indigenous to Alaska, correct?
yeah.
That's really interesting. I know a girlfriend of mine used to live in Hawaii, and she showed me the Hawaiian alphabet. It's very short. I think it was maybe like 8 or 9 characters long, and or letters long, a lot different than what we're used to with English. But I'm, very curious about the Aleutian language as well. So that's pretty interesting. When you were in school, what languages did you learn? Was it just English?
Uh, just English. There again, my counselor was like, "You should pick up a language," and I was like, "Oh yeah, which one?" And
Right.
he was like, "You should learn Spanish." I was like, "No, thank you. Uh, when am I gonna need to speak that?" Lo and behold, my future wife was Hispanic, and I couldn't speak a lick of Spanish. So
That's funny. Well, and wasn't your wife the sole teacher at one of the schools? Was it
my
either in ADAC or Dutch Harbor?
my
Was it
yeah,
ADAC?
my wife now is or was the head teacher, and there were two teachers in ADAC, but she was the main teacher. But yeah, she had, I think, the most students we had K through 12 might have been 25.
Wow. Because like, what's the population of ADAC? Just kind of roughly.
Oh, now I'd say probably under 75.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay. And is that on the same island as Dutch Harbor, or is it on a different island?
it's further out. It's almost the last island out on the Aleutian chain.
Wow,
Um,
that's interesting.
yeah,
So, when you were playing sports, whether it was in junior high or high school, did you have to take like a little Cessna, like some kind of a little plane to go to another island to play other teams?
yeah, we'd take a little 9-seater to um, Sand Point, King Cove, and then I think we'd also go to Nelson Lagoon. Yeah, and just little planes, 9-seater, and it's something else. And growing up, I I've seen it, I've done it, and then we had friends that we grew up with that moved to Dutch Harbor and had never flown a little plane. And I remember um, watching them white knuckle the chair because
Yes, or
the
scared.
turbulence. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Wow. So it's so interesting because here in Minnesota, I think back to when I was in school, people would all pack into a school bus, and oftentimes it was so cold initially you could see your breath, or sometimes the bus driver would leave the bus running when when students were inside doing something, and then come back out so that it would still be warm and the engine wouldn't freeze up or anything like that for people. But it's interesting to think that when you were in school that you would take planes to go to
Yeah,
other islands to play other teams. That's
yeah.
fascinating.
We
Wow.
would also we'd try to do anything and every activity we could just so we can come to Anchorage.
Oh yeah. Yep. I can imagine. Wow. One thing that surprised me back when I lived in Alaska is that I had thought it was going to be super cold. But one of the Christmases that I lived there was no snow because I was told we would get like the Japanese ocean currents that would warm the shore. And so, yeah, we had a Christmas up there with no snow. And then when I moved back to Minnesota in 8th grade, so this is again, the late 1980s. I remember again, no access to the internet, so people didn't know what they didn't know. But so many people would ask me, "So Jennifer, when you lived in Alaska, did you live in an igloo?" Because you just didn't know.
Right.
So it's just funny. But what would you say some of the misconceptions were, like when you and your teammates would go to Anchorage and they would find out that you were from one of the Aleutian Islands? Did people have certain assumptions about like what life was like on the islands, or were they kind of fighting their own fight too in Alaska or in Anchorage as far as the cold or the darkness in the winter and things like that?
No, I didn't really get any of that in Anchorage. Once we'd go down south, I remember we were on, I want to say Venice Beach, and somebody had heard. I think one of us was wearing a shirt from Alaska, and they're like, "Hey, are you from?" We're like, "Yeah, we're Alaskan native," and they're really, do you guys live in igloos? So it
Right.
was the most asked question anytime anybody found out. So I
Yeah.
became real a real piece of work, and I my reply would be, yeah, a two-story with a wood stove on the second floor.
Right, right, right.
Really? And I'm like,
Right.
no, we live in a house just like you do.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that because people didn't have access to information back then, you just didn't know, and
Right.
it's also interesting to think of just the stories up there about the cold. So, like for example, when I was in Alaska this past summer, I met a mechanic, and we were talking about manual transmissions because I love driving a stick. I'm one of those few people who still likes driving a clutch and a stick. And he said that he's aware of stories up in Fairbanks, which is of course like northern Alaska, up by like the Arctic Circle, like maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours away from the Arctic Circle. But he said that there are stories up there of people who drive a manual transmission, and they will use their emergency brake to park the car even on a flat surface, because when the weather gets so cold, it can thicken the oil in the engine, and then it sometimes has been known to shift the cars in gear, and then the cars all of a sudden start moving when nobody's in it. So they've learned to just do their emergency brake on a flat surface, and then they're fine. But I'm wondering, do you have any anecdotal stories as far as whether it was back when you were growing up or even now, just different ways that people try to deal with the cold like that? Or, for example, in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, because my dad's in Wisconsin, I know people like him who, if they run out of room in their freezer or in the refrigerator for baked goods or meals, they're like, well, who cares? I'll just put stuff on the workbench in the garage, because the garage is as cold as your refrigerator. So you just
Right.
you use it to your advantage. So I'm wondering, do you have any stories like that as far as anecdotal stuff about dealing with a cold?
No, say just pretty much the same.
Hmm.
Not so much like when I lived in Adak, we would always have um the power generators would cut out a lot. So
Okay.
it tends to blow the compressor on your freezers or your fridges. So then we got to where we would just put stuff in the garage during the winter on a shelf to where it's cold and it'll be okay.
Right, right. There's there was somebody else I met when I was up there who shared this story about how her husband works for the railroad, and he loves to have these, like, I think they were burritos, some kind of a little frozen entree. We'll say burritos. It was something like that, and they were normally frozen at their house, and he wanted to bring them to work. Well, working for the railroad, sometimes he would be in his car because it would be so cold outside. He would have to drive to the railroad track to like supervise his people. And so what he would do is he would bring one of his burritos with him, and rather than not eat what he wants, he would just bring the burrito, but in his car, he would turn on the defrost button, and he would put his burrito over the air vent and use the defrost button to thaw out his burrito, because that's normal, you know.
Right?
But it's just you learn to adapt. You learn, which is the whole theme of my book. It's when you can't not experience something, you figure out the how. You just kind
Right.
of,
Yeah.
you just go with it.
Yeah. It's like saying there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's
Yeah.
always a way to figure it out, but whether you want to put the work into it or not is
Right. Right. That's up to you, for sure, for sure. But even I know I went to Cordova, Alaska, and it took me 3 flights to get there. And so I flew from I think it was Anchorage to Juneau, and then Juneau to like a commercial fishing village area, and then from there to Cordova. And Cordova, people think, is a city that's on an island, but really it's not. It's on a peninsula in Alaska, but on the far side of the peninsula, it's blocked by mountains. And so it used to be until an earthquake happened that a railroad would go to Cordova. And then when an earthquake happened, it kind of screwed up the railroad, and people figured that it'd be so expensive to fix the railroad that people would rather just stay where they are. And if they have to, they'll go someplace by boat or they'll go someplace by a plane. I mean, there were a lot of little 6-seater planes or 9-seater planes I would see that people had. But yeah, it was a small fishing village. And when I was there visiting someone, I was actually there for work. He goes, yeah, I knew that you were here to visit me at my office. And I said, well, how is that? And he said, because I saw you pull up in your rental car, and I knew that you didn't look familiar, so you had to be visiting. Because the town is so small that if you see a stranger, you know that they're visiting from someplace else. So
Yeah.
just a different mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Growing up in a small community, it's like our mom, she could tell us what we did that day without us even knowing she knew. It was like she was in good with the cops, and
Oh, right,
oh
right,
yeah, yeah,
right,
yeah,
right. That's who do you by your first name, maybe?
yeah, exactly.
That's funny. So no, your dad was a state representative in Alaska, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
And so as part of that, would he have to meet with people from whether it was other states or possibly even other countries, but other people back then that would come to Alaska?
yeah. He would go, what, when they're in session 3 months out of the year in Juneau. He'd go down, but he would also, like, his district, I believe, was the Aleutian chain to Dillingham. I think as far as up as it went. I think, could be wrong. So he would visit all his districts or communities in his district, and but yeah, like he's been to DC. Gosh, I think he went there in the late '60s
Okay.
for the. He was also a member of the Alu Corporation board, and um, yeah, he's told some stories about going to DC and New York for the Alu Corporation. Yeah, that was
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, what are some of the examples of things that he would represent for that board?
uh just different fishing. uh I don't know how you'd call it, numbers or um
Oh, like how many fish you get to catch?
yeah,
Like,
that be yeah, it's, I don't know, I couldn't think of the proper name, or um my brother Pat's probably laughing and saying, oh, it's this,
yeah,
but
right. No worries, no worries. So because you mentioned like with your childhood and going to the Russian Orthodox Church, what were some of the things like did you see anything from the Russian culture or from the traditions and customs of the church that people might find interesting who aren't a part of that? And we don't have those here that I'm aware of in Minnesota. So they're really beautiful churches.
yeah, I don't know where, there's one close to my brother lives in Cloquet, and I
Which
think
is where I
there's
grew up, by the
one.
way.
I believe there's one north or south of
Oh, interesting.
that they go to every once in a while when they can. The I don't know. I guess most people are fascinated by the icons. Um, like anytime, so when we had our general store, our mom would always send us to these Ace Hardware shows.
Okay.
And they're like football stadium huge.
Okay.
And so anytime we go, we went to Dallas, we went to DC, and anytime we'd go to these different shows, we'd always look up what churches are nearby, and we're in DC, and we went to the Metropolitan Cathedral, and it was during Lent. And if you've never been to Russian Orthodox church during
Oh,
Lent, you kneel more in half the service,
oh,
and
wow. Okay.
they had cobblestone floors.
Ouch.
Yeah, I was like, all right, whose bright idea was this?
Well, plus, are the services in Russian?
Yeah, we went to the one that was in Russian, and then they had Russian. Uh, they also had a service in English, but I we went to the service in Russian at that
Okay,
one. Yeah,
cool. Well, I didn't know until I was in Seward, Alaska last summer that there are little Russian villages in Alaska. I've been told mostly on the Kenai Peninsula, but I can't. I'm not. I haven't confirmed that. But little villages of Russians who all speak Russian. They're dressed very conservatively. I know I saw a woman in Seward who had a dress that was about down to her ankles, and she had like a little cloth hat on, and she looked, and her husband looked almost like Amish kind of, like
yeah,
very like
exactly.
traditional, like basic kind of clothes. And I was told that oftentimes within those little Russian villages in Alaska, that to this day, a lot of times they revolve around commercial fishing, and that it's
Yeah,
common for their kids to go to school until maybe 12 or 15, something like that. And then after that, they join the family business, and it's all the commercial fishing stuff. And so again, growing up in northern Minnesota by Lake Superior, with the
mm,
exception of those 2 years I was in Alaska, but not now I've been in Minneapolis for a long time. I had no clue that in Alaska that there are these little villages where people speak Russian and have a lot of the customs. And I saw when I was there, I drove by and took pictures of some of the churches and saw how beautiful they are. So that's fascinating.
yeah.
You know, did you ever go to school with any of those people, or perhaps play against them in sports or anything?
I don't think so. We played mostly any surrounding schools of Anchorage or the Aleutian chain, but none that were, I don't think, any Russian affiliation or however you want to
Okay.
say it. But
I'm not sure what the name is of this little town, or maybe it was two towns that were just together and divided by a river. But when I was in Alaska, I heard about this very remote area, like super remote place where people live. And the kids will take a little plane to school every day because the school is on one side of the river. And the school is for both kids on both sides. And I asked the guy who was sharing the story with me, I said, you know what? I said, I hate to be super naive here, but it is what it is, I guess. I said, why not just build a bridge? I said, why have a plane to do this? Like, why not have a bridge? And he looks at me and he goes, yeah, you must be from the lower 48. And I said, yeah, I'm from Minnesota. And he goes, it is such a remote place to live. It would be so expensive to get the equipment there to build a bridge and to get the supplies there to build a bridge. He goes, they're just better off using their airplane that they already use to get groceries and stuff like that because it's already a known cost. But he said just to get the people there with the knowledge to build the bridge and then the equipment and everything would just be too expensive. And I thought, wow, there really is a remote village that to this day they still justify having an airplane to have kids get to school, which is pretty interesting.
yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we, I was too little, but our mom would take a skiff across the channel,
And I'm
which
sorry, what's
there's
this?
a
What's a skiff?
it just a little boat, almost like a John boat, like a lake boat
Okay,
with a single outboard motor on the back, and it's open, top open, or like a bass boat. But
okay,
she would put me in a backpack, put me on her back, and then the two older brothers would sit on a bench, and we'd go across, and we'd go to the grocery store, and then we'd go back, and yeah, of course I was too young to remember,
Right.
but this stories, yeah,
Wow. Well, and where your mom was raised, was it also in either Dutch Harbor or a neighboring town? Or where, okay.
yeah.
What kind of stories did you hear from her childhood as far as
um,
how remote things were, and did they really even have contact with people outside of the town or the
yeah,
village?
yeah, they did. No different than, I mean, it was a little less traveling than when I grew up. um she didn't really do a whole lot of traveling, but if she wanted to go to any of the close communities, they would hike.
Okay,
But
okay.
by that time, even she was too young to, before they took all the small communities and moved everybody to Unalaska or Dutch Harbor.
Oh, so you mean the small villages of people who are indigenous to Alaska were relocated,
Yeah.
and she was a part of that?
No, she was too
Okay.
too young, is what I was saying. To
Wow.
They closed those communities up, and before she was born, but she also heard stories of how people would either hike a day's worth of hiking or take boats to the other edge of the island and see people that way.
I wonder why people were moved. I was it a matter of like just natural resources, or
I
I don't even know.
I think so. I
Okay.
Just because trying to get supplies to them, and
Yeah.
it was, I mean, if you grew up in Alaska, and the ocean water is just, it's unforgiving. So the risk that would, yeah.
I could see that. So I'm also wondering, have you ever been to Whittier, Alaska?
Yep.
So that's also a place I was last summer. And just for context for the listeners, yeah, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Whittier is an old military base, correct?
Yes.
And now it's a railroad town and a commercial fishing town.
Yeah.
And like 90% of the people who live there are all in the same building,
Yeah.
the same condo building. It's so interesting. So if people want more information, you should Google Whittier, Alaska. And yeah,
Yep.
and it's most of the town is in the same building. And I had asked someone who lived there, I said, why don't people just build houses? And again, showing that I'm not from there because I'm asking questions that they might find stupid. But I was told that the railroad owns most of the land, and so you just can't build on it. And this building that like 90% of the town lives in is like a X amount of stories of condos or apartments. And in the basement, they have their church services. They also have their laundromat, their dry cleaner, their little grocery store place, all in the same building. And the school is behind the building, and there's a tunnel that goes to the school in case it's too cold for the kids to walk outside. I mean,
Yeah.
amazing. And I had and when I went there, and tell me if this was different for you, I had to go through a tunnel. I had to drive through a tunnel, and the tunnel has a railroad bed embedded in it. So if a train's going through, then a car can't go through. But it's only one way. So if a
Right.
car's going this way, then that means a car can't come this way. You have to actually wait for a light to turn in order to go one way.
Right.
And once that tunnel closes for the night, you're stuck unless you get on a boat or you get on a plane.
Yeah.
But that's crazy.
Yeah. We almost missed coming out one time, and I looked at our mom and I was like, I'm gonna be upset if we're stuck overnight. Of course, she had to stop and pee, so
Of
we
course.
cut it too close, and we're like, get in the car so we can make line. But yeah, it was the last time they were allowing cars to go back through to leave Whittier, and otherwise you're stuck overnight.
Yes. Yes. It's so interesting. And I had asked somebody else who I met when I was walking around, I said, "Do you ever feel kind of isolated? Kind of do you ever wonder like, well, what's the rest of the world up to, or is it kind of like, well, this is all you know, this is your sense of normal, and you're just okay with it, you know?" And she said, actually, she said, "I'm totally fine with it." She said, "I grew up here. This is all I know." And she goes, "Think about people in cities like New York City, where they live in their apartment building. Chances are their little grocery store and their dry cleaner or whatever else is probably all within maybe a couple block radius. And so they might not, travel a whole lot either if they don't get out and be social that much. They might just stay in the same area." And she said it's the same thing for us. And she talked about how before people there got access to the internet, and which it would have been like she said like late 1990s, like early 2000. It's like people just didn't know what they didn't know because they were cut off from the outside world. And so that brings me back to you and I, given that we're within a couple of years of each other as far as when we were born. Do you remember when you got access to the internet, how it felt to all of a sudden see things outside of where you were?
Yeah, it like opened the door to everything. I believe I was in high school, and is when we've pretty much like when our school got internet access, and I was like, wait, what?
Inner what?
You want me to look up what? And just yeah, it I mean, we didn't what did we care about what was outside of our norms? So, but yeah, having the teachers give us different assignments to look up different places, I was like, wow, okay, the internet's pretty
Right.
cool.
It kind of makes me think of my grandma's dad fought in World War One. And so he had to get on one of the big ships that sent our military overseas. And she talked about how her dad, along with everybody else he knew on the ship, had never seen anything European before, unless it was actually in the US. Like someone moved to the US and brought with them something from Europe. But again, there was no cable TV. There was actually like no TV either, like no basic TV. All you had was the radio. No internet. There were no smartphones. There was nothing. It was like the radio if you were lucky. And so to
Yeah,
get on one of those ships and go to World War One, it's like their eyes were just like the size of saucers, as he described it to my grandma later, because it was a whole world. They just didn't know what it was even going to be like.
right.
So crazy stuff.
Yeah, it was had to have been mind blowing. I mean,
Mhm. Yeah.
I've
So
seen like I've been on Coast Guard boats, and it's not as big as I'm sure what you said your grandpa went on, and the amount of wiring for all the electronics on those ships are. I was like, how do you keep everything's white? How do you know what's what?
right, right. Yeah, fair point. Uh, I also think about how before I had access to the internet, I took a double decker tour bus tour of different parts of Manhattan. And so I'm on the top of this tour bus, with a guide going around the city. And again, no internet access. This is a long time ago. So I didn't know what I didn't know. So all of a sudden the bus turns into this neighborhood, and you had buildings on both sides of the street. But then above the street, where you might have like a stoplight or something, there'd be like a rope across it, and it would have decorations that were red, white, and green. And it was like, every so many feet, red, white, and green, red, white, and green. And I was there in July. So I remember thinking to myself, I wonder why they still have their Christmas decorations outside. Well, imagine my surprise when I learned they weren't Christmas decorations. It was Little Italy. It was the colors from the Italian flag. But I didn't know that because I wouldn't even know, because we didn't know.
Right, right.
It was just so weird. And so it's just, I don't know, it's just kind of crazy. But when you did see kind of the outside world in that regard, did it make you kind of curious about the outside world? Or were you like, yeah, you know what, I'm good. I'm good, being where I am.
Yeah, I was probably, I didn't really think much of outside my realm, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, because honestly, I was like, where am I gonna go? I don't need to know anything.
Right, right, right.
Nothing out of the ordinary.
Right. Yeah, I can appreciate that. Have you ever been up to Fairbanks?
Yes.
So just for the listeners, for context, Fairbanks is about a 7-hour drive or so north of Anchorage. So it's like way up there in Alaska, way up there. And when I was there, I was talking to some people who work there, and I learned that every year they have it's either a baseball game or a baseball tournament of sorts. I think it's called like, is it called like the Land of the Midnight Sun or something like that? Because they'll play the game and it's like almost midnight because it's daylight.
Right.
It's not dark. So it's pretty interesting how that works with the daylight, and I also think back to when I was there with my family. My mom had a hard time getting my brother and me to come in to go to bed at night because it was like 10 o'clock at night. We're playing kickball outside. And we're like, what? It's
Right.
daylight. Why would we go to bed? But how did that affect you as far as having like a dark almost 24 hours a day in the winter versus all the daylight in the summer?
Uh, I don't think it. Again, I don't think it affected me. It affected me once I had kids, and my kids were like, "Oh, it's still daylight. I can still be up." And we're like,
Yes,
"No,
yes.
no, you can't."
Yep, yep, that's true. Well, and I was also surprised to learn when I was in Fairbanks that I think maybe 20 minutes away or so, that there's a town called the North Pole. So I can
Yep.
say now that I've been to the North Pole and I went to Santa's house, and
Right.
there are actual people who either work at Santa's house or who volunteer to answer letters that kids write from around the world to Santa.
I
They
believe
get sent.
so. Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
pretty cool. But so is there anything that I haven't asked about today that you want to share with people, whether it's a, a story from growing up as far as like the equivalent of hopping on an airplane to go play sports, or things you did as far as playing in, World War II ruins, or or just kind of being in Dutch Harbor and yeah, in the Aleutian chain of Alaska? Anything you can think of?
No, no, I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
Cool. All right. Well, I really appreciate this. It's been so great to meet you and hear some of your stories, and really appreciate it. And for those of you who are listening today, thank you so much for being here. Again, please feel free to go to YouTube and like and subscribe to my podcast channel called Emotional Grit. And thank you for being here.